ballroom of Silvermane Pack glowed like the inside of a golden dream. Crystal chandeliers caught the candlelight and scattered it across the marble floor in warm, trembling pieces. The air smelled of night roses and expensive perfume. Couples moved in slow, graceful circles near the center of the room, their laughter soft and sweet and perfectly rehearsed. Near the wall, a little apart from all of it, stood Chloe Wolfington. She wore a gown the color of winter fog. It was clean and well-pressed and entirely forgettable. Around her, other women shimmered in emerald green and deep gold. Their jewelry caught the light, their laughter carried. Their presence filled every corner of the room. Chloe's presence filled nothing. She held a glass of water she had not touched. She watched the room with the quiet, careful eyes of someone who had learned, very early, that watching was safer than hoping. She was 29 years old, and she was unmated. In Silvermane Pack, those two facts together were not simply unfortunate. They were a kind of verdict. "Oh, Chloe." The voice came from her left, bright and careless as a dropped coin. Her younger sister Celine appeared beside her, wearing emerald silk that made her dark hair look like something painted. She tilted her head. "You look tired. Have you been in the nursery again? You really should let the servants handle the children. It's not as though anyone is watching you earn points tonight." Chloe said nothing. She had learned that silence was the cleanest response. Celine smiled the way someone smiles when they are certain they have won. "I only say it because someone should. You spend all your time with Omega children and old wolves and... Honestly, Chloe, no mate is going to knock on the nursery door looking for a wife. We all know it." The room nearby had gone quietly attentive. Not obviously, not rudely, but eyes had drifted over, ears had tilted. People always paid attention when Celine spoke, because Celine always said the things others only thought. Then Vesper appeared on Chloe's right. Vesper was the youngest Wolfington daughter, and she moved through rooms the way sunlight moves through water, effortlessly, drawing everything toward her. She wore gold that evening, deep and warm, and on her wrist sat a bracelet of moonstone and silver that every woman in the room had already noticed and quietly envied. Vesper lifted her wrist just slightly as she came to stand beside her older sister. "It was not an accident. Mating gifts," Vesper said, with the soft, sympathetic voice of someone delivering bad news they are actually very pleased about. "Sterling sent it with his last letter. He says the real ceremony gifts will be even more beautiful." She glanced at Chloe's bare wrists. "I keep forgetting you would not know what it feels like to receive one. I am sorry. That was thoughtless of me." It was not thoughtless. Nothing Vesper said was ever thoughtless. Chloe felt the familiar ache move through her chest. Not sharp, not new, just steady, the way old bruises ache in cold weather. She had felt this particular pain so many times that she had stopped being surprised by it. She had simply learned to breathe around it. She thought, briefly, about all the things she could say. She could remind Vesper that she had sat beside their mother's sickbed for 3 days without sleeping, when Vesper was too frightened to come inside the room. She could remind Celine that she had been the one to dry Celine's tears after her first heartbreak, the one who had stayed up all night listening, and never once made Celine feel small for crying. She could say a great many things. She said none of them, because at that moment, across the ballroom, their father rose from his seat at the high table. Alpha Atticus Wolfington was a large man, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, with the kind of presence that made every room feel smaller, simply by containing him. When he raised his glass, the musicians lowered their instruments. When he spoke, the room listened without being asked. "Tonight," he said, his voice carrying easily across the marble floor, "we celebrate the strength of this family. Celine," he looked toward her with unmistakable warmth, "whose union with the Iron Fang line will bring us influence in the Western Territories." He smiled. "And Vesper, whose promised mate from the Stormclaw pack will secure our northern borders for a generation." Applause moved through the room like warm water. Then Alpha Atticus let his gaze move, almost reluctantly, toward the wall, toward Chloe. His expression did not harden exactly. It simply emptied. The warmth that had been there a moment ago quietly left. the way a fire leaves when you stop feeding it. Every one of my daughters, he said, has brought honor to this family. A pause, a breath, except one. The ballroom went still, not gradually, all at once, as if the air itself had been pressed flat. Chloe stood very straight. She had told herself, before tonight, that nothing her father said could still land this hard. She had been wrong. It always landed, every single time. She set her glass down on the small table beside her, without making a sound. She turned toward the door. She was very good at leaving rooms without being noticed. She had been practicing for years. She had taken perhaps 4 steps when the great ballroom doors swung open. Cold air rushed in from the mountain night beyond, clean and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and frost and something else. Something that made every wolf in the room straighten slightly without knowing why. Power. Royal guards in silver and black entered first, moving with practiced precision, taking positions on either side of the doorway. Behind them came 2 advisors in formal dress. And then, stillness, as if the room had taken a breath and forgotten to release it. The herald lifted his voice. His Majesty, Alpha King Xavier Blackthorn. He stepped through the doors. He was tall, dark-haired, sharp-jawed, with the kind of controlled stillness that comes not from peace, but from discipline. He wore black and deep blue with no unnecessary decoration, and his eyes moved across the room the way a general surveys a field, taking in everything, committing to nothing. Every head in the ballroom dipped in respect. Every head except Chloe's. She had frozen. She was standing halfway between her spot by the wall and the door she had been trying to reach, 4 steps into her quiet escape, and she was now standing directly in the path of the Alpha King's gaze as he entered the room. He looked at her. It lasted only a moment. His eyes moved on, sweeping the rest of the ballroom with the same measured calm. Chloe did not move. She stood in her grey gown in the middle of a golden room, with humiliation still warm in her chest, and tears she had not allowed herself to cry, pressing quietly behind her eyes. And she did not know, could not possibly know, that the most powerful wolf in the kingdom had just walked into the room where everyone had decided she was worth nothing. She did not know what that would mean. Not yet. Chloe Wolfington had not always been invisible. There was a time, very early, when she was perhaps 7 or 8, when she had been the one people noticed first. Not because she was the loudest or the most beautiful, but because she had a way of paying attention to people that made them feel, for the length of the conversation, as though they were the most important person in any room. Her mother had been the same way. Ilara Wolfington had been a healer before she became the Alpha's mate, and she had carried that instinct with her into her marriage and her home and her family. She had taught Chloe, from the time Chloe was old enough to understand, that kindness was not weakness, that seeing people, truly seeing them, was its own kind of strength. The wolves who are loudest, Ilara had told her once, sitting beside Chloe on the nursery floor while small Omega children played around them, are often the ones who feel the least certain of their place. You don't need to be loud, little wolf. You just need to be present. Presence is rarer than people think. Chloe had been 12 years old when her mother died. It was a quiet death, as those things go. An illness that came slowly, and then, at the end, all at once. Ilara had been in her bed by the time winter came, and she had not left it again. Chloe had sat with her every day, reading to her, bringing her warm tea, holding her hand when the pain was bad, and pretending not to notice when her mother could not hold the cup steady. Celine had come once or twice, standing in the doorway and crying, unable to stay for long. Vesper had been too young, or said she was. Atticus had visited in the mornings and the evenings, with a kind of rigid, helpless grief that made him useless for anything tender. He had loved his wife the way strong men often love, enormously and badly, without the vocabulary for it. So it had been Chloe. Chloe who stayed. Chloe who learned. Chloe who, after her mother passed in the early hours of a February morning, quietly and without being asked, became the heart of a household that had no idea what it owed her. She was 12 years old. She learned herb medicine from the pack's elder healer, a wiry woman named Thessaly Moonshadow, who had the patience of stone and the sharpness of a knife. She learned how to calm an Omega child in the grip of fear. She learned how to speak to the elderly wolves of the pack, the ones who had outlived their mates and their usefulness, who sat in corners and were mostly forgotten, in a way that made them feel remembered. She managed the household accounts by 15. She organized the winter supply distribution by 17. She trained the younger servants kindly and effectively, without ever raising her voice. And still, in Silvermane Pack, a she-wolf was measured by her mate bond, by the strength of the male who chose her, and the alliance it created, and the status it confirmed. Kindness did not appear on any ledger. Quiet service bought no jewelry. And so, as Chloe's younger sisters grew into their beauty and their social graces and began collecting admirers the way other people collect small stones, Chloe began to disappear. Not suddenly, gradually, the way candles burn down, one slow inch at a time. There had been, once, a possibility of something different. His name had been Hunter Hawthorne, and he had been a border warrior, tall and brown-haired and honest in the uncomplicated way of men who have spent most of their lives outdoors. He had arrived at Silvermane Pack on a 2-year security assignment when Chloe was 21, and they had found each other in the way quiet people sometimes find each other, slowly, without announcement, in the margins of other people's louder stories. They had walked together in the evenings, talked, shared books and opinions, and, eventually, the kind of careful, hopeful silences that mean more than most conversations. Chloe had waited for the moon goddess to confirm the bond, had been so certain some nights that she could almost feel it, something warm and right and steady, pulling her toward him. The bond never came, and when she told her father she wished to continue the relationship regardless, Atticus had looked at her with that flat, empty expression she had since come to know so well, and told her that Hunter lacked the status required for a formal union with an alpha's daughter. That sentiment was not strategy. That Chloe needed to think about what she owed the family, rather than what she wanted for herself. Hunter had been reassigned to a distant frontier post 3 months later. Letters had come for a while, then fewer, then none. Then, in the autumn of Chloe's 23rd year, word arrived that there had been a rogue attack on the frontier outpost. Casualties were confirmed. Hunter Hawthorne was listed among the missing. No body was ever recovered. Chloe had cried in her room for one night, quietly, and then she had gotten up the next morning and gone to sit with the Omega children and told herself that grief was a thing you carried, not a thing you were buried by. She was still carrying it. Now, at 29, she ran the Wolfington estate with quiet efficiency, cared for anyone who needed caring for, and attended every pack gathering in gowns that were appropriate and unmemorable because she had long since stopped trying to be noticed. It did not seem to matter what she wore. She was the forgotten daughter. Everyone had decided so. What no one in Silvermane Pack was paying attention to, on the evening of the moon ball, was a royal schedule change posted in the capital 3 days prior. A last-minute addition, quietly confirmed, that placed Alpha King Xavier Blackthorne on the guest list for a gathering he had not attended in 7 years. The servants knew, the herald knew, the pack's chief advisor, Pemberton Grimclaw, knew, and had been quietly anxious about it for days. But Chloe was in the kitchens that afternoon, helping a small Omega boy named Beckett Ravenwolf manage his fear of crowds, and she did not know. She was kneeling on the kitchen floor with Beckett in her lap, telling him a story about a small wolf who was afraid of thunder, but learned to count the seconds between the lightning and the sound. And she was not thinking about kings or balls or the evening ahead. She was thinking about whether Beckett's breathing had slowed enough that she could bring him to the nursery for a rest before the celebration began. She was thinking, as she always thought, about whoever was in front of her. Xavier Blackthorne had been ruler of the northern wolf kingdoms for 11 years, and in those 11 years, he had learned a very particular skill. He had learned how to enter a room and see it completely before anyone in it had time to compose themselves for his benefit. It was not a gift he had been born with. It was something he had earned, painfully, at the age of 24, when a woman named Isolde Frostfang had spent 4 months making him believe she cared for him, truly cared for him, The man behind the title, before her father's political agenda, made her real motivations unmistakably clear. He had not been naive, exactly. He had been young and tired of being alone, and Isolde had been very skilled at appearing genuine. That, he now understood, was its own kind of talent. After Isolde, he had become careful. He watched the way people's eyes moved when they spoke to him. He noticed when admiration arrived too quickly, too completely, without the normal friction of a person still making up their mind. He had learned to distrust anyone who wanted nothing visibly from him, because in his experience, those were the people who wanted the most. They simply knew better than to show it. His advisors had been pressing, for 3 years now, about the matter of Aluna. Your Majesty, Cornelius Ashclaw, his chief advisor, had said just last week, spreading a folder of proposals across the council table, with the resigned patience of a man who had delivered this particular speech many times. The northern kingdoms are stable and strong, but stability requires continuity. A royal line, an heir. The Pax look to you for leadership, and part of that leadership is... I know what it is, Xavier had said. Cornelius had waited. Send me a schedule of the upcoming Pack gatherings, Xavier had said. I will attend what is reasonable, which was how he had found himself, on a cold autumn evening, in a royal carriage, heading southeast toward Silvermane territory. Not because he expected anything from the moon ball, but because he had made a promise to his advisor, and his advisor had been right, even if Xavier would have preferred him not to be. He looked out the window at the dark trees moving past, and thought about what he always thought about on these journeys. How many women would position themselves in his direct path tonight? How many fathers would engineer an introduction? How many people in that room would see him, and see, not him, but the crown he wore, and everything attached to it, the territories, the power, the political advantage of a royal connection. He was not bitter about it, exactly. It was simply the truth of his life, and he had made his peace with it. He had not made his peace with the loneliness that came with it. That was a different matter. The carriage rolled on through the mountain dark, and Xavier pressed his thumb against the signet ring on his right hand, an old habit, something to do when his thoughts grew uncomfortable, and told himself that tonight was simply another evening to endure politely. He was not expecting anything. He was not expecting her. The royal musicians began the formal sequence within 15 minutes of Xavier's arrival. He had taken his position on the elevated platform at the north end of the ballroom, a small, tastefully decorated dais that put him above the crowd without requiring him to stand on it for long. Cornelius stood at his right. A rotating presentation of Pack nobles moved through introductions at his left, each one carefully selected, carefully dressed, carefully prepared to make a favorable impression. Celine Wolfington was among the first. She was, Xavier acknowledged privately, striking. Dark hair, bright eyes, a kind of performative warmth that she aimed at him like a well-practiced beam of light. She spoke of her mating alliance with the Iron Fang line, with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed her talking points in a mirror. Such an interesting pack, Xavier said, because it required saying. Celine's smile brightened by several degrees. He did not feel anything. Vesper came through the line shortly after, younger, softer, with her moonstone bracelet arranged precisely where it caught the most candlelight. She spoke of her promised mate from the Stormclaw pack, with a carefully balanced mixture of pride and modest happiness. Xavier nodded at appropriate intervals and noticed that her eyes, while aimed at his face, were actually watching the room, tracking who was watching her speak to the king. He did not feel anything then either. He stepped down from the dais after the introductions concluded. He accepted a glass he did not particularly want, and moved through the room with the practiced, courteous pace of a man who had learned how to be present without being available. He was near the east side of the ballroom when it happened. A small sound, not quite a cry, more of a surprised gasp, drew his eye to the dance floor. A young boy, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, had stumbled near the edge of the marble. An Omega child, clearly. The slight build, the quick nervous look around him as he fell, the way he seemed braced already for whatever came next. The floor around him was full of people. Not a single one moved toward him. A noblewoman to his left actually stepped back, as if proximity to the child might be somehow inconvenient. Two men nearby continued their conversation. A woman in blue glanced at the boy, and then at her partner, and raised her eyebrows briefly. In that way people raise their eyebrows when they have noticed something mildly unpleasant and chosen to ignore it. Then a figure came quickly through the edge of the crowd. She was wearing grey. Xavier watched her kneel beside the boy without pausing, without looking around first to see who was watching, without the brief hesitation of someone calculating the social cost of the moment. She simply went to him the way water goes downhill, directly, without effort, as if there were no other natural direction. She spoke to the boy quietly. Xavier could not hear the words from where he stood, but he could see the boy's shoulders loosen. He could see the way the child leaned slightly into her, that instinctive animal trust that small creatures extend only to those who have never given them reason to be afraid. She checked the boy's scraped knee. She produced a small square of clean cloth from somewhere. Xavier had no idea where. It had appeared in her hand like a small magic, and pressed it gently to the graze. Then she said something that made the boy smile, a real smile, surprised out of him. She took the child's hand and led him carefully toward the servants at the edge of the room, spoke briefly with them, made sure the boy was settled and comfortable, and then turned back toward the ballroom. She walked directly into Celine Wolfington's orbit. Xavier watched. Celine said something. The exact words were lost in the noise of the room, but the shape of them was clear. Her chin lifted. Her smile was the particular smile of a person delivering a cut they have been saving. Around her, several nearby guests laughed. The woman in grey stood very still. Her back was straight. She did not look at the floor. She did not cry. But Xavier could see, from where he stood across the room, the exact moment the words landed. The slight stiffening around her jaw, the brief, controlled stillness that was the opposite of tears. She was going to walk away. Xavier set down his glass and moved. He was not entirely sure, afterward, that he had made a conscious decision. It felt less like a choice than like a direction. The way you step toward warmth without thinking. He crossed the dance floor at a steady pace, and the crowd parted for him automatically, the way it always did, and he walked past Celine Wolfington without looking at her, past two other beautifully dressed noblewomen who had positioned themselves in his path with varying degrees of hope, past all of it, and stopped in front of the woman in the grey gown. She looked up at him. Her eyes were a warm, serious brown. Up close, she had the kind of face that asked nothing of you. No performance, no response. Just an honest, slightly startled attention that he realized, in the same moment, he had not seen on a person's face in a very long time. He extended his hand. "May I have this dance?" The ballroom did not stop, exactly. The music continued. But the quality of the room changed. The way a room changes when a window opens and the air shifts. He could feel it without looking. The slow, turning attention of 200 wolves, suddenly redirected toward this single spot. The woman in grey stared at his hand. He could see her working it out. Could see the moment she decided that she must have misunderstood something, that there was a more logical explanation for what was happening, that perhaps he had confused her with someone standing nearby. "My lord," she said softly. I think, perhaps, Chloe Wolfington," he said. "Eldest daughter of Alpha Atticus." "Yes?" She looked startled that he knew her name. He had made it his business to know everyone's name before entering a room. It was one of the disciplines. But he didn't explain that. He simply waited, his hand still extended, patient and unhurried. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. And then, with the careful, slightly incredulous care of someone who is not entirely certain the ground will hold, but is stepping onto it anyway, she placed her hand in his. Her hand was warm. There was a small callus on her right palm, the kind that came from years of actual work, not decoration. Xavier led her to the floor. He felt, somewhere beneath the practiced discipline of the evening, something settle, something quiet and unexpected, like a lamp being lit in a room you had forgotten had windows. They danced. That was the simple truth of it. They danced while 200 wolves watched in collective shock, and the music played, and the candles burned, and Chloe Wolfington moved through it in a fog of complete disbelief. She had been dancing since she was 7 years old. Elara had made sure of it. Not for performance, but because her mother had believed that learning to move with someone was one of the small, undervalued ways of learning to trust. Chloe had good instincts for it, for following and leading in the same motion, for reading the slight shifts of weight that meant a turn was coming. She followed Xavier Blackthorne well. He noticed. "You dance as though you're actually paying attention," he said, after a moment. He said it the way someone says something they were not planning to say. She looked at him carefully. "Is that unusual?" "In my experience," he said, "most people are thinking about the watching." She understood what he meant. The awareness of the room's eyes, the performance of being seen with someone worth being seen with. "I am not sure I'm capable of that particular type of thinking," she admitted. "I notice what is in front of me. Everything else goes a little blurry." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more careful than that. Like a door opening one careful inch. "That boy," he said. "The child who fell." She glanced up at him. "Beckett. You know his name. He was frightened before the ball even started. I sat with him in the kitchen this afternoon." She paused. He did not want to come tonight, but the servants could not leave him alone. He was managing fairly well until the crowd got loud. Xavier was quiet for a moment. The music turned, and they turned with it. No one else moved toward him. "No," she said simply. She was not performing modesty or offering it as evidence of her virtue. She was simply reporting what had been true. "Why did you?" She considered the question as though it genuinely surprised her. "Because he needed someone too." The dance ended. They stepped apart. Chloe felt the room's attention like a second skin against her, pressing, bewildered, furious in some quadrants. She could feel her sister's gazes in particular, 2 precise points of heat from across the room. Xavier inclined his head. "Thank you, Lady Wolfington." "Thank you, Your Majesty," she said. "Because what else did you say?" He walked back toward his advisors. Chloe walked back toward the wall. She stood there for the remainder of the evening, in a kind of stunned quiet, replaying it. The warmth of his hand, the directness of his questions, the way he had looked at her. Not the way men usually looked past her, and not the way they looked at her sisters. That particular heated assessment, but something she did not have a word for. Careful and honest and fully present. She told herself it was a courtesy, a royal kindness. Something he did at every gathering. Found the most overlooked person in the room and showed them a moment of consideration. A gesture, nothing more. She told herself that on the carriage home, while Celine sat silent with a fury she was too controlled to release, and Vesper stared out the window with a careful, calculating blankness. She told herself that when she reached her room and stood at the window and looked out at the mountain dark and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something she could not name moving through her chest. She told herself it was nothing. She had almost convinced herself when, 3 days later, a royal messenger arrived at Wolfington estate. The scroll was sealed with the black and silver crest of the Blackthorn crown. Pemberton Grimclaw, the pack's chief advisor, received it with shaking hands and brought it to Alpha Atticus's study, where Atticus read it twice and then sat down heavily in his chair. The message requested a return visit to Silvermane territory. It requested, specifically, the company of Lady Chloe Wolfington of Wolfington Estate. Within an hour, Alpha Atticus knocked on Chloe's door himself, something he had not done in years. He stood in the doorway with a different expression than the one she had been receiving from him her entire adult life. There was something new in it, uncertain, recalculating. "The king," he said, without quite meeting her eyes, "has expressed a wish to call on you." Chloe looked at her father. She thought about the ballroom, about, "Every one of my daughters has brought honor to this family, except one." She said, very quietly, "I see, you should." "Prepare yourself," Atticus said. "Wear something appropriate, something less." He gestured vaguely at her grey morning dress. Chloe nodded. She felt something cold and clear move through her, underneath the warmth. A recognition. Her father's attention was not love. It had never been love, not really. Not the kind that did not require her to be useful to him. It was simply that she had become, overnight, politically significant. She closed the door gently after he left. She stood in the middle of her room and decided, very deliberately, that she was not going to let that recognition ruin what was coming. Whatever was coming. Xavier arrived 4 days later. He came without the full royal entourage, a smaller party, more personal. Cornelius rode with him, and 2 guards, and a packmate named Remington Darkhowl who served as a kind of informal companion and had the useful quality of being comfortable with silence. Atticus greeted them at the estate gate with a warmth he had not displayed the first time, because the first time he had not known the king would take particular notice of his forgotten daughter. Chloe met them in the garden. She was wearing a dress the color of deep plum, not gold, not silver, not a performance, but a color that was hers, chosen for herself, which was already different from most of what she had worn in public for years. Xavier saw her at the garden gate, and something in his posture changed. She would not have noticed it if she had not been the kind of person who noticed things quietly and without announcing them. "Lady Wolfington," he said. "Your Majesty," she said. Atticus hovered nearby for approximately 3 minutes before Cornelius engaged him in a conversation about border policy that seemed, to Chloe's quiet gratitude, to be entirely intentional. She and Xavier walked into the garden. The estate's south garden in autumn was her favorite place in all of Silvermane territory. The roses were past their peak, but still beautiful, that late-season richness when the colors deepened before the cold. The path wound past an old stone bench, where she had sat every morning since her mother died, reading or thinking, or simply being still. They walked without rushing. "You are quiet," Xavier said after a while. "I am always quiet," she said. "It is not discomfort." "I know," he said. "That is why I said it." She looked at him. He looked back, with that same direct, unhurried attention. "Most people are quiet around me because they are nervous. You are quiet because it is your nature. There is a difference." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You noticed a great deal at the ball." For a man who was supposedly surveying the room, the corner of his mouth moved, just slightly. "I was surveying the room. You were in it." She did not know what to do with that, so she kept walking. They talked. Truly talked. The kind of talking that happens when 2 people stop performing and simply speak. He asked about the pack, not the politics of it, about the daily shape of it, the people in it, the small things. She answered honestly, with the kind of specific detail that comes from a person who has been paying close attention for a long time. She told him about Beckett's stutter and how it disappeared when he was excited about something he loved. She told him about the Eastern Omega family who had lost their eldest son in the summer and still came to pack meals even though it was clearly painful, because they were afraid of what isolation would do to them. She told him about old Hale Winterclaw, who had been the pack's best tracker before his knees gave out, and who now sat in the corner of every gathering looking at nothing. "I bring him tea," she said, "and I ask him about the eastern routes. He knows more about Silvermane territory than anyone alive." He lights up when someone remembers to ask. Xavier was looking at her with an expression she did not recognize. "You see people," he said. "Does not everyone?" "No," he said. "They don't." A long, clean silence. Then Xavier said, carefully, "I would like to visit again, if that is acceptable to you." Chloe considered him, really considered him, the same way she considered everything, with the unhurried attention her mother had taught her. She looked at his face and found nothing performed in it. No angles, no calculations that she could detect. "It is acceptable to me," she said. October passed in a changed light. Xavier came 4 more times in 3 weeks, then twice in a single week. The visits were not announced with ceremony or received with the formal parade that had accompanied his first arrival. They became, gradually, something quieter and more ordinary. A carriage at the garden gate, a walk, a conversation, an afternoon shared over tea in the estate library, while rain moved across the mountains and the light went golden through the windows. They read to each other. That was Chloe's favorite thing, though she would not have said so. would not have ranked the moments because ranking them felt like the kind of thing that invited them to end. She had a habit of reading passages aloud when they moved her, simply because she found it difficult to keep beautiful language entirely inside, and Xavier had, by the second visit, developed the habit of listening with his head slightly tilted and his eyes on the fire or the window, giving the words the space they needed. He told her about the northern kingdoms, not the governance of them. She could have read that in any report. He told her about the particular quality of winter at altitude in the eastern mountains, where the sky turned a color of blue that had no equivalent word in any language he had found. He told her about a small border village called Ashfen, where the Omega children ran the pack's mail route in the summer, and were paid in bread, and took their work extraordinarily seriously. "You love them," she said once, quietly. "Your people." He was quiet for a moment. "I protect them," he said. "Those are different things." He looked at her. "Yes," he said after a beat. "Yes, they are." A pause. "I think, perhaps, I stopped letting myself love them at some point. It felt too much like a weight I might drop." She understood that. She understood it in the specific, embodied way of someone who had made the same trade, the same quiet bargain with themselves. Give what you can and hold the rest back, because if you pour everything out and it still doesn't matter, the loss is unsurvivable. "I stopped allowing myself certain kinds of hope," she told him, on a rain afternoon in the third week, when the fire was low and the room was dim, and something about the softness of the light made honesty easier. "After a loss, a long time ago, I decided that useful was safer than hopeful. You can always be more useful. Hope is not something you can manufacture." He did not ask who. He waited, instead, with the quality of someone who knows that rushing a person toward a wound is the best way to make them close it again. She told him about Hunter, not all of it, not the deep grief of it, but the shape of it. The border warrior who had been kind and honest, and then gone. The letters that had stopped. The silence afterward. Xavier listened through the whole of it. "I am sorry," he said, when she was done. Simply that. No advice, no reframing, no silver lining. Just the acknowledgement. It was, Chloe thought, one of the most useful things anyone had said to her in years. She told him so, and he looked briefly startled, and then he laughed. A real laugh, not polished, slightly surprised out of him, the way Beckett's smile had been surprised out of him on the ballroom floor. She thought, "I would like to make him laugh again." She did not say it, but she thought it. Meanwhile, in other rooms of Wolfington estate, her sisters were having different conversations entirely. Celine and Vesper had watched Xavier's return visits with an evolving cocktail of emotions that had started as shock, moved through confusion, and arrived, by the third week, at something adjacent to fury, wrapped in a reasonable-sounding explanation. "He feels sorry for her," Celine said, sitting in Vesper's room late one evening, her voice pitched at the precise frequency of someone performing analysis while actually performing anger. "That is all this is." He noticed that father was unkind to her at the ball. He is a powerful man, with a strong sense of fairness, and he is balancing a perceived injustice. Vesper was brushing her hair at the mirror. "He has visited 4 times, Celine. Pity can be persistent." Celine leaned back against the headboard. "He will lose interest. She has nothing to offer him. She has no political connections. She has no particular beauty. She is Chloe." She said her sister's name the way you might say the word for something ordinary. A table, a door, a thing that is simply there. Vesper was quiet for a moment. What if he doesn't lose interest? A longer pause. "He will," Celine said. And she said it with enough conviction that she had almost convinced herself. But she had not quite convinced herself. And that night, she began, with great care and absolute deniability, to let certain quiet suggestions drift through the pack's social channels. That the king's attention was charitable in nature. That Chloe had, perhaps, accidentally created a situation that a man of the king's decency felt obligated to follow through on. That kindness, the king's and Chloe's, was very sweet, but was not love. These things moved through the pack the way rumors always move, quietly, in corners, between people who would not admit to repeating them. Chloe heard fragments. A lowered voice that stopped when she entered a room. A look exchanged between two women at a packed lunch that she recognized, with the practiced instinct of long experience, as being about her. The old insecurity came back. Not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, the way cold comes back into a room when the fire lowers. She began to pull back, in the barely perceptible way that careful people pull back. Still present, still warm, but with something held in reserve that had not been held there before. Xavier noticed. He noticed because he had been paying attention to her from the beginning, with the particular attentiveness of someone who has learned that the details people try to hide are always more important than the ones they perform. On his 5th visit, sitting in the library with the fire going, and a book neither of them was reading, he looked at her and said, "Something has changed." "Nothing has changed," she said. He did not argue. He said, "All right," and went back to the book, and let the afternoon pass in the ordinary quiet. But he was watching, and he was starting to understand. Xavier arrived on a Thursday with no prior notice. This was not unusual anymore. The formality of his visits had decreased so steadily that Chloe's small household had simply begun to treat the sight of a royal carriage at the garden gate as a normal domestic event, like the milk delivery or the morning post. He arrived in the mid-morning. The butler took his coat. Cornelius settled in the front sitting room with a stack of correspondence, as was his custom. Remington Darkhowl wandered toward the kitchen, as was his. Xavier went looking for Chloe. He found, instead, a conversation. He heard Celine's voice first, coming through the half-open door of the small morning room at the end of the east corridor. He was not eavesdropping. He had been walking past, heading toward the library, when the words reached him and stopped him. "She actually believes it," Celine was saying, in the particular tone people use when they have decided pity and contempt are the same thing. "That is what is genuinely sad. She thinks this is real." Well, that was Vesper, slower and more careful, but not kinder. She has not had much experience with anyone paying real attention to her. She would not necessarily know the difference. "The king is not heartless," Celine said. He saw a woman being treated badly at a public event, and he responded, "That is exactly what a man of his character would do. He is correcting an injustice. He is not," a brief pause, with something sharp underneath it, "falling in love with Chloe. That is absurd. What could she possibly give him that any of 100 other women could not give him better?" A silence. "She will realize eventually," Vesper said. "Better sooner." "Yes," Celine agreed. "And when she does, she'll go back to the nursery and the elder wolves and her quiet little life, and everything will return to normal." Xavier stood in the corridor for a moment after they finished. He could feel something moving through him, not rage exactly, something colder and more deliberate. The particular quality of feeling you have when something has been named that needed to be addressed. He pushed the morning room door open. Both sisters turned. The sight of the Alpha King standing in the doorway of their morning room produced, in both Celine and Vesper Wolfington, a particular quality of stillness that had very little grace in it. "Your Majesty," Celine managed, "we did not know you had arrived." "Clearly," Xavier said. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him with the quiet, deliberate care of a man who has no intention of shouting, but wants the space to be unambiguous. He did not sit. He stood with his hands loosely at his sides and looked at them with the same measured calm he brought to every difficult conversation. "I want to address what I heard," he said. Neither sister spoke. "I chose to dance with your sister at the moon ball," he said. "I did so because I observed something in her that I have not observed in a long time, and I wanted to spend more time in her company to understand it better. I have now done so, over a number of weeks, and I want to be very direct with you both about what I have found." A pause. Long enough to be intentional. "Your sister is not a woman who requires pity. She does not require correction or rescue or charity. What she requires is exactly what she has never received in this household. The simple respect of being seen accurately." Celine opened her mouth. "I am not finished," Xavier said, with a gentleness that was somehow harder than sharpness. Celine closed her mouth. "She is the reason this estate functions. She is the reason the Omega children in this pack have someone in their corner. She is the reason old Hale Winterclaw still feels remembered. He paused. She has served this family and this pack with extraordinary care for years, and she has received, in return, the particular unkindness of being told that what she offered was not valuable because it did not come wrapped in status or beauty or a mate bond. He let that sit for a moment. What I feel for your sister, he said, is not pity. If you spread that particular story through this pack again, you will find that I have very specific opinions about people who attempt to dismantle the dignity of a woman they are supposed to love. He looked at both of them, once, with the quality of attention that ended conversations. Then he left the room. He found Chloe in the garden, exactly where he had expected to find her, on the old stone bench near the late roses, with a book in her lap that she was not reading, her face tilted slightly up toward the grey autumn sky, as though looking for something. She heard his footsteps and turned. She read his face immediately. She was, as he had come to know, very good at reading faces. You heard something, she said. Yes, he said. He sat down beside her on the bench, which was not a formally appropriate thing for a king to do, and which neither of them commented on. My sisters, she said. Not a question. Yes. She looked down at the closed book in her lap. She was quiet for a long moment, and he let the quiet exist without trying to fill it. Then she said, very softly, Is it true? He looked at her. Is what true? That you... She stopped. Started again. I know who I am, she said. I know what I am, and what I am not. I have known it for a long time, and I have made a kind of peace with it, mostly. But if what you have been... She pressed her lips together. I would rather know. Xavier looked at her profile. The straight, honest line of her. The way she held her back carefully upright even now, when she was braced for something painful. It is not true, he said. She turned to look at him. I did not dance with you at the moon ball because I felt sorry for you, he said. I danced with you because I watched you cross a ballroom to kneel beside a frightened child when everyone else looked away, and I thought, there is a person who is not performing anything. I cannot afford to let that walk out the door. She held very still. I have spent 11 years, he said, surrounded by performance, by people who smile at the right moments and say the right things, and want very specific things from me that have nothing to do with who I actually am. You are the first person in a long time who has spoken to me as though we are simply two people in a room. You are the first person who has made me feel... He stopped, chose the word carefully. Ordinary, in the best sense of the word. Something was happening to her face. The careful stillness was loosening, the way ice loosens when the temperature finally shifts, not all at once, but the structure of it releasing, piece by piece. I am, she said, and her voice was very quiet, afraid to believe that. I know, he said. I understand exactly why. A long silence. The garden around them was very still, and the late roses moved slightly in the cool air, and somewhere in the estate, a door closed and the sound was very far away. Will you let me try? He said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, yes. 2 weeks after Xavier's conversation with her sisters, he sent word through Cornelius to Alpha Atticus Wolfington that he would be returning to Silvermane territory. He requested that the full pack be gathered. Atticus received this news with the complicated feelings of a man who has realized, too late and too clearly, the full dimensions of a mistake he cannot take back. He thought about his daughter in her grey gown by the wall. He thought about the words he had spoken at the moon ball, with the easy cruelty of someone who had never had to consider the cost of them. He thought about the expression on Chloe's face in that silence. He prepared the estate. Chloe did not know what Xavier had planned. He had told her only that he was coming. He had asked, the previous week, on a quiet afternoon in the library when the fire was going, and the room was warm and safe, and they had long since stopped being careful about how much they revealed to each other. A single question. If someone were to offer you something permanent, he said, would you be afraid of it? She had considered this honestly, the way she considered everything. I would be afraid, she said. I do not think that is the same as refusing it. He had looked at her for a long time, with that open, careful expression. "No," he said, "it is not." She had understood then that something was coming. She had spent the 2 weeks since in a state of quiet, humming alertness, not anxious, exactly, but alive to everything, in a way she had not been in years. She noticed the weight of sunlight in the mornings. She noticed the smell of the roses past their season, beautiful and going. She noticed Beckett's laugh in the nursery and old Hale Winterclaw's satisfaction when she sat with him and asked about the eastern routes. She noticed everything. She was in the garden the morning Xavier arrived, not because she was waiting. She was never waiting. Waiting was not something she did. She had learned too well the cost of it. But because it was where she went to be quiet, and she needed quiet. She heard the carriage. She stayed where she was. He came to her. He walked through the garden gate and across the path to the bench where she sat, and he looked at her with an expression she had been learning to read over these weeks. The specific warmth of it, the absence of performance, the thing she did not have a word for, but had come to understand, was his real face, the one beneath the Alpha King. He sat beside her. "I need to tell you something," he said, "before anything else today." "All right," she said. "I told you, the last time I saw you, that you made me feel ordinary." He paused. "That was true, and also insufficient. What I mean is, you remind me of what it is to be a person rather than a position. You look at me and see me, not the crown, not the territories, not the political advantage of my company." He turned to face her directly. "I have not been looked at that way in a very long time. I did not realize how much I missed it until you." Chloe was very still. "I am in love with you," Xavier said. "That is the truth I have been arriving at for weeks, and I want to say it plainly before I say anything else, because everything else follows from it, and I want you to know that the order is correct." She felt the words move through her like something unlocking. For a moment, she did not speak. She sat with it, the weight of it, the impossibility of it, the absolute reality of it. "Xavier," she said, and she used his name, his actual name, which she had never done before, and she watched something shift in his face at the sound of it. "I think I have been in love with you for some time," she said. "I was not going to say it first because I was not certain it was the kind of thing I was allowed to have." He looked at her with something that might have been, in anyone else, the beginning of tears, but in him was simply an unguarded openness that was more honest than most things she had seen. "You are allowed," he said. Then he reached into his coat and withdrew something. A ring, simple and beautiful, dark stone in silver setting, chosen with the precision of a man who had paid attention. She looked at it. "I would like you to stand beside me," he said. "Not because you are convenient, not because you improve my political position, not because the kingdoms require a Luna, because you are the person I want beside me, because I would rather spend an afternoon with you in a garden than a week with anyone else in a palace." He held the ring in his palm, not pressing it toward her, giving her the space to consider it. She thought about the girl she had been, who had believed kindness was enough. She thought about her mother's hands and Hunter's letters, and 17 years of winter supply distribution, and small Omega children, and old wolves who needed tea, and someone to ask the right questions. She thought about grey gowns and walls, and the particular quality of silence after the word, "accept." She took the ring. She did not put it on immediately. She held it in her hand, and looked at it, and felt the real weight of it. Not heavy, exactly, just present, solid, true. "Yes," she said. He took the ring gently from her, and placed it on her finger himself, and his hands were steady and warm and entirely certain. She looked at her hand. She looked at him. She did not cry, but it was a near thing, and the nearliness of it was its own kind of feeling, the edge of a great emotion that you stand at the top of and look down into without falling, simply understanding how deep it goes. That afternoon, the pack gathered in the great hall of Wolfington estate. Alpha Atticus stood at the front, his face composed in the careful neutrality of a man managing competing emotions, guilt, pride, relief, and something adjacent to shame that he was working very hard not to examine too directly. Celine and Vesper stood to his right, dressed beautifully, saying nothing. The pack's alphas, advisors, noble families, and senior members filled the room. Cornelius stood near the wall. Remington Darkhowl, who was not particularly given to ceremony, had nonetheless managed to look pleased. Xavier entered without ceremony, just walked in from the garden corridor, calmly and without announcement, and moved to stand before the assembled pack. He looked at Chloe, who had come in through the side door and was standing slightly apart from her family, as she had always stood, and he crossed the room to stand beside her. Not in front of her, beside her. The room was very quiet. "I have come today," Xavier said, addressing the room with the clear, carrying voice of a man accustomed to speaking to large groups, to make something known to the Silvermane pack and to the broader Northern Alliance. He looked at Chloe. "Lady Chloe Wolfington is the woman I have chosen," he said. "She will become my Luna, not because circumstance requires it, not because her family's position makes it useful, but because she is the finest person I have had the privilege of knowing, and I do not use that word carelessly." The room absorbed this. "I want the pack to understand what that means," he continued. "It means that a woman who spent 17 years serving this community without recognition has been seen. It means that quiet strength is strength. It means that the worth of a person is not measured by the mate bond they receive or the status they carry, but by what they give. And by that measure, Chloe Wolfington has outranked every person in this room for a very long time." Absolute silence. Then, from somewhere in the back of the room, a sound. Applause. Soft at first, uncertain, the way applause sounds when people are still catching up to their own feelings. Then louder. The pack's elder healer, Thessaly Moonshadow, was the first to her feet. Behind her, the Frostfang Omega families. Then the Northern Alphas. Then the advisors. Then, one by one, the room. Atticus Wolfington stood with his hands at his sides and looked at his eldest daughter standing beside the Alpha King, and his face showed something she had not seen there in 17 years. He was proud of her, not because she was useful, not because she had become politically significant, but because he was being forced, finally, to look at who she actually was, and even he, even with all his failures of attention, could see it. He looked as though he might speak. Chloe looked at him once, quietly, with the expression of someone who has moved past the wound into something beyond it, not healed, exactly, but free of it, in a new way. Then she turned back to Xavier. In the corner, Celine stood with her arms crossed, something working itself out behind her eyes. She did not applaud immediately, but she did not leave either. And in the last moment before the room broke into proper celebration, Chloe saw something on her sister's face that she had not expected. Not jealousy, not fury, something smaller and more honest than either. Something that looked, if you knew how to read it, like beginning to understand. Later, when the celebration had loosened into a normal evening, food and conversation and the ordinary sounds of a pack at ease, Xavier and Chloe walked out into the garden. The autumn night was cold and clear. The stars above the mountain were extraordinarily bright, the way they got when the air was completely still and the darkness around them was complete. Chloe stopped at the stone bench and looked up. She was wearing the ring. She kept noticing it, the slight unfamiliar weight of it, the way it caught the starlight when she moved her hand. "I spent a long time," she said, "believing that being unseen was just the shape of my life, that it was not something that happened to me, but something I simply was." Xavier stood beside her, looking at the same sky. "You are the most visible person I have ever met," he said. "People simply had to be paying attention." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the face she had come to know as his real one, open and honest and wholly present, the Alpha King nowhere in evidence. Just a man in a garden in the dark, telling the truth. "I saw you," he said, "the moment you knelt beside that frightened child." She felt the words move through her, slow and warm and settling, like light filling a room that has been closed for a very long time. She slipped her hand into his. He closed his fingers around hers, steady and unhurried, as though he had been waiting to do exactly that since the evening they met. Above them, the mountains were dark and old and enormous. The stars burned very quietly. Somewhere inside the estate, Beckett Ravenwolf was asleep in the nursery, and old Hale Winterclaw was at home with his tea and his memories of the eastern routes, and the pack was full of people who had been seen and not seen, and loved and forgotten in all the various ways people are. And Chloe Wolfington stood in a cold garden with a warm hand in hers, and she was not the forgotten daughter. She was not the sister no one wanted. She was not the woman by the wall in the grey gown. She was not the absence at the end of her father's sentence, the exception to the praise, the one the room laughed about. She was chosen, not because she had tried to be, not because she had perfected herself or performed her virtue or arranged herself to be seen, because she had knelt on a marble floor for a frightened child and not thought about who was watching, because she had brought tea to an old man who had stopped expecting anyone to remember him, because she had been, in every room and every season, exactly and only who she was, and that, in the end, had been enough, more than enough. That had been everything.